Good evening, everyone, or whatever time of the day that this video finds you. In keeping with my commitment to record our podcast on a Wednesday and allow for publications on that day, I am taking this opportunity, albeit late, to record today's podcast on the topic of applications under the Mental Health Act of Trinidad and Tobago. The contents of this podcast relates exclusively to Trinidad and Tobago persons and or applicants. And I hope you find some value in the content and that it is particularly favorable because very recently we have seen mental health being quite topical. And usually in the past we would have seen mental health being an area that is discussed quite heavily in relation to the older population. But as recent as the discussion surrounding Britney Spears, fondly referred to as the Princess of Pop, who had in the past or over the years struggled with mental health. You would recall she would have had a public mental breakdown over a decade ago. And given that she had an extensive estate, having, as we call her, been called the Princess of Pop, she would have had a lot of assets, having acquired those in her career as a singer, songwriter, and dancer. So after her breakdown, a court-approved conservatorship was placed in on or allowed to be put in place in February of 2008, with her father being appointed the conservator. And very later on, then it was her father jointly with an attorney. Then the attorney resigned, and later on, it became the father again. And the issue came back into the public's current domain because she's now asking for that conservatorship to end, but on the basis of her not being evaluated. And then in the recent Tokyo Olympics, we heard about Naomi Osaka, mental health issues about with regards to Simone Biles. So whilst traditionally we would have been having those discussions in relation to older people, we have seen very recently that those discussions and challenges are actually happening along the younger population as well as the older population. So we thought it a little timely to then have that discussion around what happens in the case of someone who has been declared to have a mental disorder or a mental disorder and disability, and there are assets that that person has, responsibilities that that person has, and you want to assist in the ongoing responsibilities, including caring for them. What can be done in those circumstances? So typically what happens, to bring that issue home to Trinidad and Tobago, an application can be made by a public officer or next of kin. And people often ask us, when you say next of kin, who do you mean? That ranges from a child to a spouse to a parent, a grandparent, a brother or sister. And if you look at the Mental Health Act, Chapter 2802, it then sets out for you who usually can be the range of applicants that can make an application under the Act. So there are a number of things that the person is required to do, the applicant, before the court is comfortable with appointing a person or persons to exercise control over the property or affairs of a patient. A patient is what they refer to as the person who has been deemed to have a mental disorder. Or the court alternatively can appoint a committee of the patient's property. That is what you call it, a committee. And the order can extend to making provisions for persons or payments that the patient would have otherwise made had the person not had that mental health challenge. And I will encourage you to take a look at the Act because the Act is very clear in setting out or defining who the Act sees as a patient, someone suffering from or is suspected from suffering from a mental illness or who is mentally subnormal. And it also defines mental illness or a mentally ill person as a person who is suffering from a disorder or of the mind that he or she requires care, supervision, treatment, and control. And the examples we have seen over the years include stroke victims, persons with mild or advanced stages of dementia, persons with mild or advanced stages of Alzheimer's. Those are usually the scenarios we have seen people making applications under the Mental Health Act. So, in terms of the applicant is required to demonstrate to the court that the patient suffers from a mental disorder or is mentally incapable of managing his or her own affairs. This would require them to adduce the patient's mental records, which is normally affixed to the application, along with a full description of the nature, extent, and value of the person's assets, their property, their financials, so that the court can appreciate the extent of the assets that that person is now going to be charged with having conduct of. So the range of orders, as I said, we've seen is authorizing a committee to conduct all transactions in relation to real property on behalf of the patient, receiving and utilizing any interest or benefit in relation to the property of the patient, taking and defending legal actions. It sounds quite similar to a power of attorney, but the assumption is that in the case of the power of attorney, you had the mental ability to give that authorization to enter into the power of attorney. But in this case, this is an application being made by a third party on your behalf. On occasions, we would actually see the court requiring the person who's appointed as the committee to continuously file periodic statements showing how the monies were spent and accounting for what is being, how the person's assets are being used. And there are also cases where we saw the court asking us to provide periodic medical reports. We had a client on one occasion that indicated the mental illness that that particular patient was suffering from had been prescribed as being something that could improve with time, so that over time she would well be able to manage her own affairs, which is the argument I believe Britney Spears is seeking to make in these circumstances. That I'm now in a position that I could then relinquish whomsoever has been taking care of my affairs and allow that to be transferred back to me. I always highlight that in like manner that we underscore the importance of the welfare principle when dealing with children in the family court. The welfare principle is also highly considered when making these court orders when these applicants come before the court, because the welfare of the patient is of paramount importance when these orders are being made. In terms of what is required by the intended applicant, they are required to furnish information on the applicants, on their names, or it could be done jointly. So the applicant's names, the relationship to the patient, what relationship they have, brother, sister, uncle, whatever their relationship in terms of next of kin, or a public officer, as we said earlier. Also, the order they are seeking, the grounds upon which they are seeking this order. And this is normally done by way of a fixed date claim form supported by an affidavit. And the affidavit will then require the applicant, who is the intended committee, to indicate the mental condition of the patient, and not simply indicate, but adduce evidence, the assets of the patient, how the committee intends to use the assets ultimately for the benefit of the patient. So we are looking forward to hearing from you on this topic. We know, as I said, mental health is a very topical issue recently, especially now that it's growing to no longer being confined to the elder generation, but to being an issue with the younger generation. And in those cases, persons may have concerns or questions about how do you treat with someone's assets or their responsibilities financially to third parties if they are not in a state to be able to manage their affairs. And for Trinidad and Tobago, that's done by way of an application under the Mental Health Act. So I'm interested to hear from you. If persons have made applications, what has been their experience? Were they concerned about not being able to make those applications, and why? As usual, we expect feedback and interaction from you as we continue to engage in these podcasts for the purposes of education. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and do have a good evening. Bye.